This is John Justin Bunting. He is responsible for the worst serial murders in Australian history. His crimes were so disturbing, so inhuman, that even the most experienced investigators admitted they had never seen anything like it. Between 1992 and 1999, he and his group committed 12 murders that shocked not only Australia, but the entire world. What began as a supposed crusade against pedophiles spiraled into a nightmare of torture, sadism, and horror. On May 20th, 1999, police arrived at an abandoned bank in Snowtown, a small town north of Adelaide. What they discovered that day would be forever marked in the history of crime. Inside the bank vault, there were 6 black plastic barrels. When investigators opened the first one, the smell hit them like a punch. Inside, dissolved in acid, floated the remains of human beings. In total, 8 bodies were stored in those barrels, mutilated, dismembered, forced into tiny spaces. In the backyard of a house in Salisbury North, they found 2 more bodies buried. Over time, the investigation would reveal a total of 12 victims. 12 people tortured to death over 7 years of horror. The barrels had cards with names on them. Everything was organized with calculated coldness, like they were files, like they were objects. John Justin Bunting was born on September 4th, 1966, in Queensland, Australia. At age 8, he was beaten and sexually assaulted by a friend's older brother. That trauma marked him forever. As he grew up, Bunting became obsessed with weapons, anatomy, and photography. But there was something darker. From a young age, he showed special cruelty toward animals. He killed neighborhood dogs and cats. He skinned them. He enjoyed it. At 22, Bunting got a job at the SA Meat Corporation slaughterhouse. For most people, killing animals is hard and unpleasant work. For Bunting, it was different. He was fascinated. The part he enjoyed most about his job was slaughtering the animals. His co-workers remember him bragging about his knife skills. He talked about how he cut, how he separated meat from bone, how he dismantled a body with surgical precision. That experience would be fundamental years later. In 1989, he met Veronica Tripp and they married. 2 years later, they moved to Salisbury North, a poor neighborhood north of Adelaide. It was a forgotten place where vulnerable, marginalized people lived, invisible to the rest of society. That's where Bunting met his neighbors, Mark Hayden and Robert Wagner. That's where his true nature fully emerged. Bunting developed a deep hatred toward pedophiles and homosexuals, but that hatred was just an excuse. In reality, he enjoyed torturing, he enjoyed killing, and he needed a justification to make himself feel superior, powerful, righteous. He began organizing meetings at his house. He gathered neighbors and talked about supposed pedophiles in the area. He created lists of names. He invented accusations. He convinced others he was doing something good, that he was protecting the community. Little by little, he recruited Robert Wagner and James Vlasakis, a vulnerable 19-year-old. He manipulated them. He convinced them they were soldiers in a just war. But the truth was very different. Most of the victims weren't pedophiles. They were friends, acquaintances, family members, weak people with disabilities, with mental problems, people who had no one to ask about them if they disappeared. The first murder occurred around 1992. The victim was Clinton Trezise, 20 years old, a friend of the group. Bunting beat him to death with a shovel in his own living room. He accused him of being a pedophile. He called him Happy Pants after killing him, as if it were a joke. They buried the body in a shallow grave. It wasn't discovered until 2 years later, in 1994. By then, Bunting had already perfected his method. The following murders escalated in brutality. Bunting developed a pattern. First, he identified the victim. Then he lured them with some pretext. Once he had them in his power, the torture began. Victims were handcuffed, gagged, dragged to bathrooms or basements. That's where the horror began. Bunting tortured them for hours, sometimes days. The methods were atrocious. He crushed toes with pliers. He burned them with lit cigarettes. He inserted lit objects into body orifices. He applied electric shocks to genitals. He injected bleach into testicles, all while recording their screams. During the torture, he forced them to reveal banking information. He made them repeat phrases that Bunting recorded. Later, he sent those recordings to family and friends, making them believe the victim had gone on a trip. One victim was Troy Yude, 21 years old, James Vlasakis' half-brother. Bunting convinced him that Troy had abused James as a child. One night, they took him from his bed, dragged him to the bathroom, and brutally tortured him. They crushed his fingers with pliers while forcing him to give his banking details. Then, they strangled him. To make sure he was dead, Wagner jumped on his chest over and over. Frederick Brooks was 18 years old when he was murdered. Bunting became obsessed with the idea that Brooks touched young girls, though there was no evidence. They invited him to a party to celebrate his acceptance into the Australian Air Force Cadets. He was excited, but it was a trap. They took him to Bunting's house and tortured him for hours in a bathtub. They inserted lit cigarettes into his ears and nose. They shoved a lit sparkler into his urethra. They injected bleach into his testicles. They applied electric shocks. They crushed his toes. Brooks had no idea what was happening. Bunting screamed at him to confess to touching girls, but Brooks didn't know what he was talking about. There was nothing to confess. That only made the torture worse. Finally, he died choking on his own gag. The last victim was David Johnson, 24 years old, James Vlasakis' stepbrother. Bunting hated Johnson because he was clean and took care of his appearance. He called him yuppie and faggot. On May 9th, 1999, Vlasakis told Johnson there was a cheap computer for sale in Snowtown. Johnson agreed to go see it. He didn't know they were taking him to his death. As soon as he entered the abandoned bank building, they ambushed him. They handcuffed him, tortured him, forced him to read a script in front of a recorder, confessing to crimes he never committed. Vlasakis and Wagner left to try to withdraw money from his account. It didn't work because he had no funds. When they returned, Johnson was dead. Bunting claimed Johnson had kicked him, so he strangled him. But what happened next was even more disturbing. They cooked and ate parts of his flesh. After each murder, Bunting used his slaughterhouse skills to dismember the bodies. He cut them into pieces. He put them into the plastic barrels. Then he filled the barrels with acid to accelerate decomposition. He kept the barrels in different places, first at his house, then at acquaintances' properties. Finally, he moved them to the abandoned bank vault in Snowtown. He organized everything with sickening meticulousness. Meanwhile, he continued collecting the victims' social security benefits. He forged documents. He impersonated them. In total, the group stole over $97,000 from the Australian government. But money was never the main motive. Bunting killed because he enjoyed the absolute power over another person. He enjoyed seeing the fear in their eyes. He enjoyed hearing their pleas. He was a pure sadist. The group's downfall began when the disappearances became impossible to ignore. Too many people had stopped appearing. Too many families were asking about their loved ones. The police investigation into Elizabeth Hayden's disappearance led detectives to Snowtown. Elizabeth had been dragged to her bathroom, tortured and strangled while her husband and children were out. When Mark saw her remains, he laughed. Her body was put into one of the barrels with a rope still around her neck. On May 20th, 1999, when they opened the vault, police found the horror. The next day, they arrested John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden. James Vlasakis was arrested shortly after. The trial began and became the longest and most expensive in South Australian history. It lasted almost a year. The details revealed during the process horrified the nation. Vlasakis decided to cooperate with the prosecution. He confessed to 4 murders and became a key witness. His testimony, along with forensic evidence, was fundamental in convicting Bunting and Wagner. In 2003, Judge Brian Ross Martin sentenced John Bunting to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. It was the first time anyone received 11 life sentences in South Australia. Robert Wagner received 10 consecutive life sentences under the same conditions. At his sentencing, Wagner said from the dock, "Pedophiles were doing terrible things to children. The authorities didn't do anything. I decided to take action. I took that action. Thank you." James Vlasakis was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences, with a minimum period of 26 years. In August 2025, he was granted parole after serving his minimum term, though he was not immediately released into the community. Mark Hayden received 25 years with a minimum of 18. More than 250 suppression orders prevented publication of many case details for years. Only in 2011, when the film Snowtown premiered, did a judge lift the remaining orders. Australian society reacted with horror and disbelief. How was it possible that no one had stopped Bunting before? For years, he had shown clear signs: cruelty toward animals, violent behavior, obsession with weapons and death. The victims were society's most vulnerable people, people with mental and physical disabilities, people in poverty, people without close family, invisible people. The town of Snowtown was forever marked. Although only one victim was killed there, the town's name became associated with the crimes. Some residents even proposed changing the name to Rosetown to escape the stigma. Today, John Bunting remains in prison. He has never shown genuine remorse. Psychologists study him as an extreme case of antisocial personality disorder with sadistic traits. The Snowtown murders reveal the failures of a society that ignores its most vulnerable members. 12 people disappeared over 7 years, and no one asked the right questions. No one investigated enough. no one protected those who needed it most. The victims had names, but John Bunting turned them into statistics, into bodies in barrels, into forensic evidence. But they were people, and they deserve so much more than to die at the hands of a monster who thought he was God. The lesson from Snowtown is clear. When we ignore the signs of violence, when we allow vulnerable people to fall through the cracks of the system, when we look away from others' suffering, we open the door to horror. The Snowtown murders remain one of the darkest chapters in Australian criminal history, a reminder of how far human cruelty can go when combined with impunity, manipulation, and total disregard for life.